Greetings and welcome back to our lesson on classical Greece. Today we are looking at Lecture 4, which talks about the Athenian Golden Age. Why they call it the Golden Age is somewhat of a mystery. It's something that the historians threw out there because of all the buildings and stuff that they made. But it's just the time period that they're referring to that we'll talk about. Reminder about this lecture, make sure you are using your Lecture 4 note worksheet so that you can fill in the blanks and complete the questions. So let's get started. Setting the stage. The Greek civilization was a collection of city-states. As a reminder, we've talked about this in the past, back then there was really no Greek country. It was just a group of smaller cities and the surrounding areas of those cities that made up the government of each city. Those we call city-states. They're just small cities, each with their own governments. Cities such as Athens was a very democratic, very open society, which is in total contrast to Sparta, which was more of a militaristic society controlled by the military. So even though they're not that far from each other, totally different societies. They didn't call themselves Greeks. They called themselves Spartans, or they called themselves Athenians. So when we talk about ancient Greece, you need to remember we're talking about the city-states and not so much the whole country of Greece as we see it today. So let's take a look to see how things are today in Athens, just to kind of give you a picture. Today, as you can see on the top left, is a picture of the Parthenon, which is the actual messed up building on the top left there. And that lies right on top of what's known as the Acropolis. The Acropolis is the actual hill that the Parthenon sits on. So the whole hill itself is known as the Acropolis. Just a large hill where this temple sat on top of. On the bottom, you can see the port of Athens, right next to the Mediterranean Sea. And that's actually what Athens was known for, and what made it so powerful back then was that it had a very strong navy, a very strong water presence. Besides their navy being very strong, it was also allowed them to do very well with trade, making Athens very wealthy as well. Here we see a kind of a map, more than anything, of what Athens would have looked like in the 5th century BC. As I mentioned before, on the top left you got the Acropolis mountain with the Parthenon sitting right up on top. You kind of see a little walkway getting up to the entrance of the Acropolis. Just a reminder, the Parthenon itself was actually a temple to the goddess Athena. If you remember from our presentations before, the Parthenon was a gift or a temple to Athena because the name Athens comes from the goddess Athena. We won't get into all that. If you want to look back at the the movie on gods and goddesses, you can do that, and it talks about the story. But the temple was made to the goddess Athena. And underneath you see other smaller buildings relating smaller temples. You see the assembly area for the government members over there on the right and the top. Kind of a town square known as the Agora in the middle. And this obviously is just an artist's rendition of what the area might have looked like way back then. Again, you got the Acropolis and the Parthenon on top. This would be the Temple of Zeus right there on the left, if I recall correctly. As you can see, it's a very well fortified city. So certainly they had the money and the people and the manpower and the ability to create a pretty well fortified city. All right. So Athens, from around 477 to 431 BC, Athens experienced a growth in intellectual and artistic learning. This was known as the Golden Age of Athens. See if I get his name right again. Pericles held power in Athens for about 32 years. Pericles, when he had power, when he took over power, he had three main goals that he wanted to accomplish during his leadership. First, he wanted to strengthen the Athenian democracy. He let the people rule themselves for the most part. Although he was the high-end leader of within the Senate back then, or within their government, he did believe that the people should be able to rule themselves. And it created this idea of direct democracy, where the people themselves got to decide what was going on in their own city-state. His second goal was to hold and strengthen the empire. He did this by increasing its military, as well as increasing its stature in the fields of architecture and art. And finally, his third goal was to glorify Athens. And there's three subsets to this glorifying, which is kind of going along with strengthen. The first subset was the architecture, which we kind of just mentioned. He architected and built the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis. We kind of just looked at that a few moments ago. Second part to glorify was the direct democracy, which he introduced as well. This idea that the people should be able to control the government directly without representatives. And finally, he wanted to have, or he was the head of the Delinean League, which was an alliance system created after the defeat of the Persians. The way to describe the Delinean League was like modern-day United Nations. It was a group of city-states that decided to get together and work together in the hopes of promoting peace, but as well as working together for food and alliances and stuff like that. The Delinean League, although it was a good idea, and Rome was like the head of this, it didn't last very long, or was not very successful in the long run. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So here we see another picture of the Acropolis with the Parthenon on top. As you can see here, here's the path leading up to the entrance of the Acropolis. You've actually got the Parthenon obviously right there. Interesting piece about the Parthenon, it did not always act as the temple to Athena. It was also a church at one time. It became a mosque for the Muslims. And after a while, it was actually also known as kind of a storage facility for ammunition, which actually, if I remember correctly, there was an accident, and a lot of the arms inside kind of blew up. And since then, it's pretty much been useless. Obviously, it's been falling apart ever since. They've been trying to restore it and keep it structurally sound for tourists, but as you can see, it's in pretty bad shape. And another pretty picture of the Parthenon from the ground view. So let's get into the Spartans. Sparta, as you can see, was kind of to the southwest of where Athens was. Athens, see if I can pull it up here, is actually more this way. Right up there. It's a little off the map, but that kind of gives you an idea where Athens is compared to Sparta. Sparta was landlocked, so they were not exactly great militarily in regards to the navy, but their army was amazing. And that's what we're going to focus on in this next portion. Spartans, obviously, they were kind of the bullies. They kind of kicked everybody to the curb. Everybody that came up against the Spartans basically lost. The Spartans were very militaristic. Their government was controlled by the military. Very strict, very dictatorial. And another scene, obviously, from our movie, The 300. Just a little clip. Tonight we dine in hell, and tomorrow I'm thinking Arby's. Just kind of a fun clip I found. So, let's take a look at the Spartans. Sparta was a military city-state, as we talked about before, controlled by the army and the military. Sparta had a better army than the Athenians, where Athens had a better navy. Their navy was not built up. They didn't even have one. The Spartans also were not much for builders. Sure, they could build what they needed to survive, to protect themselves, but they didn't really build anything monumental, such as like a Parthenon, or statues, or sculptures, or any real pieces of work or of art. They were more militaristic. They did what they needed to do to survive and to conquer. Due to its inland location, Sparta could not be attacked by sea. This was an advantage for them when they're going to war shortly against the city of Athens. Athens was great militarily on the water. Sparta was great on land. Athens would have to fight the Spartans on their turf, which was obviously against the army on land. Many men in Sparta were soldiers for life. They were raised as soldiers. Typically when they were born or when they were young, the boys in Sparta would be picked out, taken away from their families, and trained in the military. And they would stay there pretty much as long as they lived. Which, if you were in the military there, was not very long for many of them. If you were really good at what you did, you might have lived a longer life, obviously, but for the number of battles that Sparta was always into, if you were good, you were probably put on the front lines. You might have been put into a command of a small regiment, but the lifespan of a soldier was not great, unless you were really good.